Hello, everybody. This is our digestive system notes. We're probably going to break this into two parts here. So we're going to get started. The good news is the digestive system is something that most people have a very good background knowledge on because they do it every day. So let's get started, and we are going to start with the functions. And although the functions are mostly pretty obvious, there are a few new words that, for some of you, there is. So the first part of this is ingestion, and a lot of people misuse this word. Ingestion is not digestion. Ingestion is the ability to take food in. So that's part of it. Mastication is a fancy name for chewing. Saliva plays a part in that as well, and we'll get to that. Propulsion of food, so this is not something you have to think about. You do not have to say, okay, let's move food through my stomach and into my small intestines. It happens without your brain having to work, and it uses these things called peristaltic ways. It's using smooth muscles. So those smooth muscles aren't controlled by the brain. We have to mix up foods and that is a mechanical mix, so that is largely stomach and chewing, but we have to mix it with water and enzymes and mucus, which will explain why that. We need to lubricate things in order to get them down through our digestive system, and we need to liquefy, and we need to digest. So then we have digestion. That is done by what's known as mechanical means and chemical means. Mechanical is simply the chewing part and the mixing up of the stomach. The chemical part is things like enzymes. And then probably the most important part is the absorption. The absorption is where we actually get those nutrients and the sugars and things like that from our small intestines into our blood supply so that we can actually use them in our cells. And then last but not least, of course, is elimination. So let's go through. We're going to basically follow this from the beginning to the end. We start with oral cavity, which is where all food begins. We are going to use that for ingestion and mastication. There is very few foods that actually are absorbed through your mouth, although a few things can be. The only examples I can think of foods that actually are absorbed through the oral cavity are actually certain drugs, including nicotine, like chewing tobacco and things like that. And some other drugs can be absorbed through the mouth. But most foods that you eat, they cannot be directly absorbed through the mouth. So the mouth consists of lips, cheeks, palate. The palate, there's actually two palates. There's the bottom and the top. Usually the top part of your mouth is considered the hard palate because there is a bony projection there. And then the bottom part of your mouth is considered your soft palate because there is no bone there. Tongue is a large muscle, and it is strong for its size. Every once in a while I hear people say the tongue is the strongest muscle in the body, I don't understand that at all. Maybe pound for pound it wins, but I mean, try to do a push-up with your tongue. You can't do it, and you can do that with your arms. So I don't understand the tongue is the strongest muscle in the body. It's just ounce for ounce, it is a very strong muscle. It's attached at the base with what's called a frenulum. The frenulum is that little stringy thing on the bottom side of your tongue. So if you lift up your tongue, you can kind of pluck your frenulum like a guitar string. Every once in a while, it's actually relatively common that their frenulum is overgrown, and so they can't move their tongue as much as they should be able to, and it sometimes causes eating problems and even possibly speech problems. So they have a frenectomy, or it's a removal of the frenulum. And then we have the ability to move food around. That's largely what's going on with the tongue, and it helps with the mastication. And of course, it's taste. So taste is often misunderstood. I mean, a lot of people sort of think about taste as, oh, it provides pleasure. That's really not its purpose. The purpose of taste is to determine what is good to eat and what is not good to eat. You have to think about in terms of survival here, that what is distasteful to us is distasteful because it may be bad. And those types of things that would be bad, rancid meat or, those types of things have smells and tastes that are not good. And that is because it is supposed to prevent you from eating those things. So, no, obviously everybody has slightly different tastes. So sometimes things that are actually okay for you to eat seem distasteful. So, there's a really crazy diagram of a mouth. We have our teeth, which we'll talk about in a minute. We have our uvula back here in the back of the throat. Uvula is a flap. It's a soft piece there that actually is going to allow food and water to not actually get back up into your nasal cavity, because there's a connection between your oral cavity and nasal cavity. All right. Teeth. If you're going to dentistry school, you're going to learn a lot more, but here's the basics. This is the same for the top and the bottom. Top and bottom are basically identical, but basically you have 32 total teeth. There is the top and bottom, which are sometimes referred to as the mandibular arch and the maxillary arch because they're on the mandible, and the maxillary bone. So you start out, if you're going from the back, you have 3 molars on each side, top and bottom. Then you have what are 2 premolars on the left, 2 premolars on the right. Then you get to your canine, which are just that one and that one. And then you have your 4 front teeth, which are considered your incisors. Basically, the deal is that these teeth have different functions. The molars and the premolars are designed to crush and grind. So it is really good for things like plant material. So if you, and again, this is we're talking about humans here, but one of the easiest ways to tell whether an animal is a carnivore or a herbivore is to look at their teeth, because you can tell if they have lots and lots of molars, then they're probably a herbivore. If they have many more incisors and canines, then they're probably going to be a carnivore. So, and yeah, the canines work really well, and the incisors work as scissors, and they cut and tear. Obviously, things like dogs and certain other animals have even bigger canines that allow them to grab and hold on to their prey. We don't have large ones because we don't typically eat prey that is alive and shaking around, so we don't need those big canines. Teeth are made of something called enamel. That is the white stuff that you see, and it is actually just a covering. It is not solid through and through. So underneath that dentin, there is this, underneath the enamel, that's the white part, there is this material called dentin. Dentin is the part of the cells that actually produce the enamel. And then you have a root that has nerves and blood vessels and everything that actually anchor it to the bone, whether that is the maxilla or the mandible. It's complicated, obviously, because teeth are living on the inside, not the actual enamel is not living, but if a tooth dies on the inside, then the enamel will slowly break down and it will you will lose the tooth eventually. The other thing I wanted to mention is that the enamel, this material here, is considered the hardest substance in your body. It is harder than bone. And that's a good thing, because when you chew on a bone, you want the bone to break, not your teeth. So that's important. All right, as we move through the mouth, we have salivary glands, and we're not going to talk a lot about it. There's actually several of them, and they all have slightly different purposes. They all produce saliva, but they produce different types of saliva. Some of them produce saliva that is more liquidy. Some of it produces that is higher in concentration of enzymes. The largest is the parotoid, and it's just in front of your ear, and it empties into your mouth. It produces mostly water, and you actually make about 1 liter to 1.5 liters of saliva a day. That's a lot when you think about it. And the 3 main parts of saliva, other than water, so water is by far the most abundant component of saliva. The other components include amylase, which is a enzyme that breaks down starch. So if you take bread and put it in your mouth and sort of suck on it with the saliva, you'll actually start to taste sugar, because that bread is complex carbohydrates and it starts to break the simple sugar off, and those sugars will start to actually trigger your taste buds and you'll taste sweetness. So that's amylase. Lysozyme is an antibiotic, which is it helps. It's basically almost like a soap. It's not soap, obviously, but it's like a soap in that it breaks down membranes, and when it breaks down membranes, it will destroy bacteria. So it's its own little antibiotic. Not that I suggest licking wounds like dogs do, but it is not. Saliva is not as dirty as many people think it is because of the presence of the lysozyme. And then last but not least is this chemical known as mucin, which is what makes saliva so slippery, even more slippery than water. And that's important because that allows you to swallow. I strongly recommend that in this time of lack of sports, see if you can find on ESPN a competitive eating contest and watch the hot dog eating contest. You'll notice that the people that are eating the hot dogs, they just basically swallow the hot dog, but the bun, they dip in a glass of water and then swallow it. That's because they can't produce saliva fast enough to get the bun to swallow. So what they do is they add their own makeshift saliva by just dipping the bun in water. It's kind of gross and weird, but it is related to anatomy. So there's the parotoid gland there, and there's a parotoid duct. Okay. Pharynx and esophagus. So these parts are largely just for transport, because you got to get from your mouth to your stomach. The swallowing is a very complex process. It involves voluntary and involuntary. So what has to happen is that the first thing is you basically use your tongue to push what's called a bolus. The bolus is that chewed up food, that chewed up mass of food. You push the food to the back of your mouth. And what that does is it triggers receptors largely on that uvula, that flap in the back of your throat. That when that uvula feels the pressure of that mass of food, it elevates the uvula and starts a series of muscle movements that are not actually controlled by your brain. So several things happen. One is that the uvula flips up, which makes sure that the food doesn't go up your nose, and then the epiglottis closes. The epiglottis is what covers your windpipe. So you don't want the food to actually go down into your lungs. You want it to go down into your esophagus. So once the food gets past the epiglottis and into the esophagus, there's several peristaltic waves. You can swallow while standing on your head, and the food will move to your stomach, because those muscles will actually, kind of like a tube of toothpaste, be forced down. And then at the top of your stomach, there is a muscle called an esophageal sphincter. It's basically like a little valve on the top of your stomach to make sure that whatever is in your stomach doesn't actually move up back into your esophagus. That's not the way it's supposed to go. Obviously, when you vomit and things like that, that would be an exception to that rule. But generally speaking, it's supposed to be one way. It's supposed to let stuff into the stomach, but not let it back out. Okay? So that muscle has to relax to allow the food to go in, and then it closes up. All right, I'm going to continue the rest of the muscle notes next time. Thanks, guys.